1973, many New Zealanders watched with concern as Chile's new military dictatorship imposed wide-ranging social and economic changes.
Queremos dar la confianza al mundo entero para abrir las puertas a capitales extranjeros que se deseen establecer en este país.
All opposition was crushed as state-owned corporations were sold off. Multinationals took over most of the country's natural resources. Welfare and education spending was cut. Hospitals were privatized. 10 years later, no armed force was needed when a democratically elected government began a similar program of change in New Zealand.
I guess I have to go into what we do as we analyze investment opportunities. We go through the complete economic study of an opportunity. And the basic why, of course, is profitability. So we go overseas to help our profit, as I guess any company does as they look for investment opportunities in the U.S.
During the 1970s, the multinational share of world economic activity increased rapidly.
The investor gives you his money to use so long as you give him a return, which is greater than the original. That's it. So you have to grow. You can't stand still.
Not just I, our whole management and our board would agree that we're in business to make money. We are not in business primarily to satisfy society if that requires us to lose money. Because if that's the way we go at it, we're not going to be able to satisfy society for very long because we're going to be broken out of business. So a profit has to be number one.
Profits and expansion were hindered in many parts of the world by laws regulating markets and protecting domestic business from foreign competition. In New Zealand, multinationals were frustrated by the protectionist policies that Labour and national governments had introduced over 40 years.
We've kept the standard of living of our people level. Indeed, it increased somewhat. Certainly, we've had to borrow to do it. We've seen the level of unemployment go up, but not to the levels of the wealthier countries around the world who've had less impact from the recession than we have. Their unemployment rates, almost without exception, are higher than ours, and just look across the Tasman to see that.
But within the government's own treasury, a group of economists was reviewing economic strategy. Their head, Assistant Secretary Graham Scott, described them as a ginger group. They were to become the multinationals' greatest allies.
The view that they were proposing was really that markets do know best, and that markets are places where private agents pursue private welfare, private benefit, private profit, with all the incentives that go with that. They saw markets as being enormously creative, enormously powerful allocative devices, but also better at making social judgments, better at shaping society than human agencies. And there was a real unwillingness to go back and revisit the origins of the welfare state in New Zealand, to think about why New Zealanders had come to do things the way they did. And because of the lack of historical understanding and the lack of historical depth in the work and thinking of these economists, their work really did come very directly from a single theoretical, preconceived position.
The idea that markets know best coincided with right-wing economic theories popular in American universities at the time and practiced by the conservative Reagan and Thatcher administrations. It also fitted well with right-wing attitudes about increasing individual freedom and reducing elected authority. Altogether, these ideas became known as the ideology of the new right. In New Zealand, the government's economists had a problem. Their minister, who was also the Prime Minister, didn't like their theories nor their advice.
You look at some of the taxes they're proposing. This is advice that I've rejected, of course.
I make no apology for doing it.
That the workers that we represent...
In opposition, the New Zealand Labour Party didn't have a settled alternative economic policy. But one man in the party thought he could find the answer. In 1983, the Labour caucus elected David Lange as new leader.
I am not an economist, am proud to assert that I'm not an economist, and can use them insofar as they can be used, although I remember there's a chap called Stalin once that shot them. Now, I don't intend to emulate that, but I tell you that I am not going to worship at the altar of pretending to be an economist.
He selected his friend, Roger Douglas, to be Labour's finance spokesperson.
I think it's just the nature of the man, if you like. I think I'm reasonably active in whatever I undertake, and that tends to mean that I get involved.
In developing an economic policy for Labour, Roger Douglas was assisted by Doug Andrew, an economist seconded to the Opposition Research Unit from Treasury. He and his colleagues found Roger Douglas more than ready to listen to their ideas.
The only way we're going to get out of this situation is to tackle all our problems and have good economic management.
But the problem for Roger Douglas was that these free market theories went against the traditional values of the Labour Party that he represented.
1984, presuming that is the next election, what's Labour's policy going to be?
Well, as I said, it will be along the same general lines as our policy in 78 and 81. First priority, full employment. Beyond that, we have to address ourselves to the need to make a reality of social justice. I think we've got the broad policies to do that. It's a question of refining the details and presenting them in a clearer way.
In June 1984, Prime Minister Rob Muldoon called a snap election.
Have we got a date, Prime Minister?
We got a date, the 14th of July, which we've worked out at Government House as being the appropriate date.
That doesn't give him much time to run up to an election, Prime Minister.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
The campaign was short but vigorous.
God bless you, David. I've waited a long time for this.
Muldoon's dominating manner and heavy-handed control had eroded his popularity. Support had shrunk to a hard core of loyalists. While their minister travelled the campaign trail, the Treasury economists began writing a brief for the man they hoped would become their new boss, Roger Douglas. But this was no ordinary brief for an incoming minister. It was a comprehensive prescription for transforming the New Zealand economy. Corporate tax rates reduced to attract overseas investment, real wages cut, controls on foreign exchange transactions abolished, tariff and export incentives dropped. Where possible, government activities to be commercialised or sold. Welfare spending targeted and reduced.
And I give you specifically those pledges that you seek of our commitment to jobs, to see that there is housing and educational opportunity, but above all now, to see that there is a resurgence of the culture and the manner of the people.
The National Party continued to decline in the polls. The last of a number of official reports critical of Muldoon's handling of the economy was leaked 3 days before the election.
I know the New Zealand economy better than any other living soul. In or out of the state services, in or out of politics, Parliament, anywhere else. I've lived with it intimately for 20 years. 20 years. And I know what we're doing. I know where we're going. That's where we're going. That's where we're going. And we're winning. And we're winning.
Behind me we have a Prime Minister.
theoretically I should have been very pleased. I must admit to very mixed feelings on the night of the election, and I guess I must have had some sixth sense that things were going to happen that weren't going to be all good, but not in my wildest dreams on that election night did I believe they'd be as bad as they subsequently became.
The day after the election, Prime Minister-elect David Lange was informed of a major crisis. Over the last week, there'd been a massive run on the New Zealand dollar, and foreign exchange reserves had nearly run out. Chairman of the Reserve Bank, Spencer Russell, recommended a halt to foreign exchange transactions while the crisis was sorted out. Treasury and Reserve Bank officials flew to Auckland to meet Lange and his new inner cabinet. The officials recommended devaluation by 20%. It would cost taxpayers $750 million, but it would stop the run on the dollar.
When the governor of the Reserve Bank tells me something, I listen. When the Secretary of the Treasury tells me something, I listen. When the business community and the real National Party tell me something, I listen.
Lange and the other senior MPs agreed to devalue. But, supported by officials, Roger Douglas proposed a package of further reforms, saying they were logically related to the devaluation. The package gave up government controls over many parts of the financial sector, leaving interest rates to be set by domestic and international finance markets.
I think there was a conspiracy between senior officials of the Reserve Bank and Treasury to work with elements of the Labour Party, Roger Douglas and others, to prepare a policy direction for government if the Labour Party was elected that they couldn't get past Muldoon. And it was virtually in the top drawer. And all those documents were already well prepared, if not written and printed practically. And as soon as Roger Douglas was elected and the government was elected, and I think Roger Douglas's election was more important to the Treasury really in a sense than the Labour Party, they had a Minister of Finance who was going to let them have the head.
The new Labour government's first caucus meeting was asked to endorse the devaluation.
Already perceived as we had this crisis, this financial crisis, and the atmosphere was of crisis, and we had to just do what the Cabinet, or the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance said, and we'd just been elected and we had to trust them, and they had this terrible crisis to fix and they couldn't really spend much time with us, but it'll be all right and we'll look after it and so on. That's when the alarm bells really started to ring, because I think I had a feeling I heard that kind of stuff before.
The exchange rate will be devalued by 20%. This will restore confidence in the currency, stop the speculation, and allow normal trading to proceed again.
I believe a very sensible decision has been taken. Will certainly restore, I should think, New Zealand's reputation and credit rating around the world.
2 weeks later, the new government took office. Immediately, he began to implement his program of reforms.
Taken in isolation, the major effect of devaluation will be to increase prices. Taken in isolation, the major effect of lifting interest rate controls will be to increase interest rates. Taken in isolation, a major effect of the reduction in export incentives will be to reduce the profitability of exporters. Taken together, however, these moves will improve the competitiveness of our products, help to increase employment, reduce the government deficit, and so help reduce inflation and reduce interest rates. And we are warning manufacturers that if they put up their prices excessively, that we will consider issuing further import licenses so that they face even more import competition from abroad. It is far better that we start adjusting to changes voluntarily than to have it forced upon us.
I believe that we can introduce into New Zealand competent economic management,
And I believe that if we do introduce competent economic management, which is going to take a couple of years to show the benefits, then New Zealand can climb back to being one of the richest countries in the world, and where everyone could expect an increase in their standard of living.
New Zealanders had got some idea of the extent of the reform agenda when Treasury's brief to their new minister was released some months after the election. The economy was still being described as in crisis.
This government is asking the people of New Zealand for restraint and cooperation in this grave economic crisis. It would be unreasonable to ask for that commitment from the people of New Zealand without putting all the facts in front of them.
The Treasury and Reserve Bank advice had an ideological thrust that surprised university economists.
How would you describe the values, the philosophy, which is apparent in the Treasury from this document?
I wouldn't describe it as orthodox unless you regard extreme monetarism as orthodoxy. I think that, and I agree with Suzanne Snively, one of the great revelations of this report is the extent to which the Treasury has been penetrated, I think is the word, by monetarism.
Treasury, so far as we could see, had adopted a very simplistic approach to policy advice. They had taken, as if they were settled questions, matters on which we thought professional opinion differed. They had a position which we generally identified as monetarist, but not theoretically fully consistently monetarist. It was something of a theoretical mishmash, unified by a general faith in free markets.
But I think it's important that, say, the Minister appreciates that there are monetarist views, but there are also neo-Keynesian views of how to manage an economy, and he's getting his advice from a particular perspective, right or wrong.
Over the next few months, economists with different views tried to debate the issues and the Treasury solutions to them, but they were outmanoeuvred and outgunned.
And it doesn't matter how you measure it, it comes up with the fact, as the Minister said, we've been living beyond our means for 10 years. This has produced some horrible problems which we have tried to solve by direct intervention in the economy, the command economy. It's failed, and now we are back trying something else. And hopefully we'll try a market economy.
Thank you very much.
It was generally recognised to be unwise to stick your head up and be too strongly critical of the government's position, because to do so was to invite very serious counterattack, really. Institutions which tried to represent alternative points of view tended to find themselves under strong pressure. They tended not to be able to obtain funding. In many cases, government departments, for example, the institutions themselves were in fact abolished. So the academic economists very largely went back to academic discussion. The criticism of Rogernomics would be found alive and well in the common room. It would surface occasionally at Patermister conferences. But a sustained thread of public opposition to Rogernomics did not survive.
But also
Roger Douglas announced packages reducing government protection and support for whole sections of the economy in what he called quantum leaps.
Roger Douglas's line on all this was that you sort of had to do it to them before they did it to you. And the faster you did it, the less chance there was of opposition. So it wasn't a democratic process. It was a draconian process, almost totalitarian. You just rammed it through quickly because this medicine would never be swallowed voluntarily, so it had to be forced down. The faster the better.
Today's decision then to float the exchange rate is a logical progression from all these moves. It will increase the government's ability to manage the economy for the benefit of all New Zealanders. It will increase the strength and stability of policies keeping New Zealand on track for improved future growth.
The New Zealand dollar could now be bought and sold freely, its value no longer determined by government, but by international currency traders and speculators.
3 done, sorry, sir. 3 done.
Borrowed money flowed into the country to fund more office space and new investment companies. Foreign banks set up shop.
I couldn't believe what they were saying to me. They said, we're here to lend you money. Never forget that. We're here to lend you as much as you want. 2 million, 5 million, 10 million, and somebody chipped in, sky's the limit. Any amount you want. Well, I thought they were having me on at first, but they meant it. And it's very, it makes you very dizzy. A little guy sitting there being told that you can have as much as you want, just name it.
It is a bit of a giggle, and I think it's part of being a New Zealander and the inferiority complex that goes with being a citizen of a small country. And to go into Sydney and say, right, we're going to own this joint sort of thing, which we do now actually, and we will pass the AMP, I believe, in about 3 months as the biggest property owner there. Next year's Manhattan, and we will go there and encounter a certain amount of scoffing, so it becomes a bit of a challenge to sort of knock them all over, which we will.
With many direct controls over the economy abolished, the productive sectors suffered. Jobs were lost, unemployment rose. Traditional Labour Party supporters, trade unionists and poorer working people were among the worst affected by what had become known as Rogernomics.
The ordinary workers were telling the organisers what they thought of the Labour Party, but the union leaders were trying to preserve the Labour Party intact. Margaret Wilson, who'd taken over for me as president, was a buffer between the party and the unions and the government, and she took a lot of the flack for the government and absorbed it.
Once you start a series of reforms, one is dependent upon the other. Now, I think the stage we've got to is setting in place the framework, and as I said, now we're in the process of actually implementing it. So that takes a bit longer.
Margaret's role was quite crucial, I think, to reducing the outrage and the expressions of it that would have come otherwise from a party if it had been led in the way in which I think the party could have and should have been led at that time.
But we do, I think, at times forget that the government has in fact made remarkable progress in a very short time. It is given then that the Labour Party has long preferred the mechanism of regulation and planning of the economy, it wasn't...
Well, union opposition was just as muted as the Labour Party opposition was. The unions felt that Labour was in government, should be given a chance. There was quite an element of trust. So the unions played a positive role in support of the government, most of them, not all of them, and those of us who worked with them were put on the back foot, really, and told, in a sense, to shut up.
Through working together, we can ensure that the fourth Labour government will be one of the most significant in our history. Thank you.
The next item on Roger Douglas's reform agenda was publicly owned trading organisations. Our public assets and enterprises represented attractive investment opportunities for domestic and international corporations. But most New Zealanders weren't interested in selling.
With large and fast ships, we have spanned the oceans which separate us from our neighbours, and we have provided the best of port equipment for our commerce. We have spread a trackless land with a network of roads, and over them we operate the transport of a nation. We have bonded the country with rails of steel for our steam and electric trains. With airports and aircraft, we have brought 20th century speed to a Stone Age land. We have harnessed the rivers to provide light and heat and power for our transport, our cities, and our industries.
One of our most valuable assets was the state forests.
The title of our department was service. It's the only one amongst all the government agencies that had that title, and it tried to live up to that word service to the public.
If publicly owned organisations and assets were to be sold, they first needed to be reorganised into saleable items, to be restructured. Treasury officials developed an organisational model resembling, as closely as possible, a private corporation. Once government trading organisations had been reorganised to fit this model, they'd be ready for sale.
When the decision was announced in the Cabinet room that the Forest Service and the Department of Lands and Survey were to go out of existence on the 1st of April 1987, that was the first intimation I had that that was likely to happen. Up until that point, we had been firmly led to believe by our Minister and others involved in the restructuring process that it would be necessary to divide the responsibilities of the Forest Service and remove the commercial thrust from the servicing, support and non-trading range of activities of the department. All the work we had done and all the cabinet papers and ministerial reports we had prepared were based on that premise, not on how it would be best achieved to put the Forest Service out of existence.
For Treasury's plan to work, the new organisations had to be headed by businessmen who supported the new theories. For the Forestry Corporation, Roger Douglas himself effectively made the choice, his friend Alan Gibbs and John Fernyhough.
It's just so extraordinarily exciting because it's so new. I mean, what a wonderful opportunity to be involved right at the start of what is the most novel experiment in terms of converting government-run organisations into business organisations, which hasn't been tried anywhere else in the world.
Corporatisation has been a very necessary stage to get a handle on the enterprises, to get them roughly sorted out and to get them directed in the right way.
Privately, Gibbs and Fernyhough favoured selling state assets. Publicly, Roger Douglas assured the public and his caucus colleagues that they would not be sold.
When you came to things like the corporatisation of state services, he ran the agenda on the lines that privatisation was no part of this agenda. All we wanted to do was make our government departments efficient and deliver services properly. Roger Douglas even told the caucus that once we had them running efficiently, we could make so much money out of them that we could actually remove taxation altogether.
Corporatisation produced massive redundancies. Thousands of New Zealanders lost their jobs.
What about our families?
Rogernomics was hitting most sectors. Farmers and provincial towns were badly affected.
When you're in a small concern like ours, they're not workers, they become friends, and you know, you don't kick your friends in the guts, sort of thing. But we had no choice. The downturn was so quick and severe that we had to do something to survive.
What I was saying was that I thought it would be a pity if, in the situation of the present downturn, this led to increased pressures on government to try and provide relief to certain sectors.
But if you're going to take a stand, shouldn't you become a politician?
No, because I haven't entered the political arena. I haven't told the government what they should do. I have merely expressed an opinion.
Which is support of government policies?
Indeed.
Have marched 18 kilometres from Porirua here to Parliament to hold this government accountable for its election promises. This government stood on a platform of employment, and yet since it took power, there have been nothing but broken promises.
You're not paying them award wages.
What I've got to tell
You're paying
you,
them the dollar.
the training that may not be available through the formal apprenticeship system.
Doing something decent for unemployed.
You should support any movement that stops benefit fraud.
Okay. But he has not received the unemployment benefit since then.
No, because he was offered a job in Kaitaia where he moved to, and he declined to take that job.
Yeah, because he was living at Mangamuka.
Across the road, Treasury and Reserve Bank officials were encouraging every possible expression of support for Roger Douglas and his reforms. If big business were more politically active, Cabinet's resolve would be strengthened. Economist Roger Kerr resigned his job at Treasury to become executive director of the low-profile Business Roundtable.
The ideology was developed by Treasury that didn't really traditionally carry out public debate. It was still keeping the facade of a traditional public service, even though it was much more active and was actually a political department by this time. But what Kerr's arrival at the Round Table did was that it allowed the new right to have a public face.
New Zealand has adopted a package of economic structural changes and reforms that increasingly means the rigid structures that we have got to work with within the labour movement are just totally inappropriate to today's, and in fact are not serving not only business but are not serving the interests of workers as well.
Time will prove that if we're to get the growth in the economy and the benefit from some of the very good economic changes of the last 3 years, then the labour market will need to be restructured more along the lines that we have advocated. And that is likely to happen eventually.
Kerr was a driving force, and they were his speeches, they were his thoughts, and he was the one that put the ideology together in its New Zealand form.
Round Table ideas made the headlines and helped Roger Douglas keep the momentum going. The finance ministers intended to apply the state-owned enterprise model to government trading organisations case by case. After the forests, they turned to the Ministry of Energy, with divisions covering oil and gas production, coal mining, and the electricity division, which had developed some $6 billion worth of publicly owned assets.
And so here was a new government with new ideas on how the place should be reorganised, and it was our task to make it succeed. So really there wasn't any sort of resentment or feeling that, you know, that something was wrong because they were changing our organisation. That really the question was this was now government policy once it had been approved, and our task was to get on with it.
Ministry of Energy officials reviewed their organisation and concluded the profit motive was no substitute for good planning and coordination.
I think the Ministry of Energy people who were doing their review persisted for a fairly long time, hoping that you know, their ideas would prevail, but certainly the government's concept of a state-owned enterprise won out quite clearly.
Associate Finance Minister David Kegel wanted to go even faster. With other finance ministers, he decided to impose Treasury's model simultaneously on 9 government-owned organisations. He called it a preemptive strike.
The government did not have a mandate to do what it did. It made a deliberate decision to launch the project across the board and to implement it as quickly as possible, and thereby limit the opportunity for resistance building up to it. And that was largely successful.
Another reform advocate, Reserve Bank Deputy Governor Rod Dean, was appointed head of the State Services Commission to push through changes in the public service. Business Roundtable Chairman Ron Trotter headed a small committee to recommend businessmen and women to run the state-owned enterprises. Control of the nation's resources was shifting from elected authorities to the big business elite. On the 31st of March 1987, while public servants protested outside, the Prime Minister announced the creation of 9 state corporations, including telecom, the post office, coal, electricity and land.
6 months on, the benefits of corporatisation will be assumed. They won't be celebrated, but the pains of the past will be put behind and people will be very positive about their future.
But in the rush to set up new state-owned corporations, the rights of Maori over rivers, land and other natural resources had been forgotten. The New Zealand Maori Council took the government to court.
like all ideologues, the Treasury, which was the driving force behind the assets policy, had not considered the wider human and social ramifications of that policy, and they had certainly not considered at all that Māori might use the treaty, or more broadly the rights of rangatiratanga, which predate the treaty, to oppose those policies. So if it was a moment of crisis for the Crown, it was a crisis not in terms of their assumed constitutional authority, but certainly a moment of crisis in terms of what they believed would be comparatively smooth sailing in implementing their policies.
A task force was set up inside Treasury to find ways of getting round the delays caused by Maori opposition under the Treaty of Waitangi. Under new management, the state-owned enterprise's profits rose rapidly.
How are you today?
Tens of thousands of people were made redundant.
We lost your formulas.
Every prior knowledge I'd had of government would lead one to the view that it would be unlikely that politicians would ever let businessmen have a straight go at sorting out a commercial enterprise. I thought it was likely we'd be asked to compromise, we'd be asked to consider the political implications and so on. In fact, that hasn't occurred at any point.
After 3 years in power, the Labour Party was losing its traditional voters. But a worldwide boom in share prices and easy credit combined to send the New Zealand share market to dizzy heights. The middle classes felt they were getting richer, thanks to Roger Douglas.
He's very honest. He's not intimidated by what people think. He believes that he has the answers. He's pursuing those policies, and I think he's got the strength to take them through.
Pop down a bit closer to Mr. Longy's face.
David Longy began the 1987 election campaign full of confidence. The opposition National Party had a new leader.
Let us throw out the divisive policies of David Longy. Let us throw out the failed economic theories of Roger Douglas.
And this government has made its pledge. We addressed the economy in 84 to 7, and we addressed it big. And in 87 on, we are going right into that whole area of social policy, the duty of the state in the areas of health and education to be the dominant funders, the dominant providers.
Labour's promises were short on detail, but the direction was clear. Big improvements in public health and education. Meanwhile, Treasury officials were writing a brief for their Minister of Finance. But the brief didn't suggest ways for Labour to put its promises into effect. It did the opposite, proposing a new right prescription to cut government's role in health, welfare and education. Labour's election campaign was well supported by big business and the multinationals. Of the $3.5 million Labour spent on its election campaign, thousands came from the unions, hundreds from party members, and millions from the corporate elite. A new investment company, Equity Corp, contributed $250,000.
It's not so much a political donation to a political party. It was really against the background of the program and the environment in which we were able to work.
Do you think you would have given that donation had Roger Douglas not been at the helm of economic policy?
Oh, I don't think it would have been anything like that. I'm sure it wouldn't have been. You know, he was a key player, obviously.
Can I say to you that I find it enormously fulfilling that for the first time since 1938, the Labour movement has been re-elected to a second term in New Zealand Parliament. Can I thank you?
The Prime Minister announced his new cabinet a short time ago, and the allocation of jobs confirms that the Labour government will be pushing social policy.
I will be the Prime Minister and Minister of Education.
The new minister received the usual post-election briefing papers from the Department of Education.
There will be readjustments in priorities within education, and I believe there will be readjustments in overall government expenditure, adverse to some interests and favourable to education.
But he also received Treasury's briefing papers. Volume 2 carried their proposals to reform the education system.
Although they used all the rhetoric that would appeal to David Longley, it was nevertheless there for anybody who looked that what they were really concerned about was, first of all, the purely pragmatic concern that education was a very, very greedy user of public resources, and that they wanted that cut back, pragmatic, and that also that there was a strong ideological desire to move towards the privatisation of education for purely ideological reasons. So those two factors were very, very obvious. They weren't hidden, really, to anybody who gave more than a second glance to the document. But on the other hand, it was all dressed up in terms of the education system has failed, it's failed Maori, it's failed women, it's failed almost everybody, and therefore if the Labour government wants to achieve its great ideals for education, then this is the way to go. So it was a very clever document in that it attached new right ideals and policies to old right desires to constrain education spending, to traditional left ideals about education as a liberating and democratising force.
Uncomfortable with Treasury's recommendations, David Longley went off to talk to the people working in education.
He didn't make any promises, but he was interested enough to make notes of the different queries that we had.
And a bit of disaster struck the bus.
The new minister was also waiting for a report from the PICO committee, set up to review education before the election. 9 weeks after the election, the New York stock market crashed. The next day, the New Zealand share market collapsed disastrously.
Sell Chase $4. Sell Chase $4. Come on! What? What is sell 150, 150, 150.
I just think you're again at 60 though, Tom.
195, Jones.
20. Small shareholders' savings disappeared in the fall, the worst in the world. The big new property investment companies were the first to go under. Their huge loans in the deregulated finance market turned out to have been made against virtually worthless assets. The economy went into recession, but that didn't stop the progress of the new right agenda.
I believe that the events of the last 3 weeks mean that we need to accelerate the process of reform rather than stop it.
On the 17th of December 1987, 8 weeks after the crash, the government announced further radical changes.
The commitments we make today, the signals we send to all sectors of our economy, will shape this country's economic development for the rest of this century.
The main aim was to attract international investors. Tariffs were halved, company tax was cut to below that of Australia.
It's important that our company tax rates are competitive with those of our trading partners to ensure that we get investment in New Zealand and thereby jobs. It's also important that our personal tax rates remain competitive with our trading partners so we retain skilled people.
High-income earners and investors would have massive tax cuts. But the most significant announcement was the government's sale of 13 state-owned enterprises.
It is more important that we pay off the debt than that we keep the assets.
I think it's a very bold, dramatic package which is going to put New Zealand right to the forefront of international countries.
Domestic and foreign investors welcomed the government's announcements. David Longy spent his 1987 Christmas break at the beach, pondering the way that his government was moving more and more to the right. Back from holiday, he bypassed his cabinet colleagues and went on television to reject the December income tax cuts as unfair to the low-paid.
Faced with the choice of relentlessly pursuing things which might be inequitable in application to save one's political face on the 1st of October 1988 is not something that I'm prepared to do, nor is Roger.
Roger Douglas couldn't speak for himself. He was overseas. But David Longy's about-face was great news to the opposition.
Well, it's clear that the Prime Minister's statement today is a massive vote of no confidence in Roger Douglas. It was he who prevailed to make the announcement on December the 17th.
In December we had a very positive statement. We had a cart with all 4 wheels and a packet of goodies in it, and now the wheels seem to have fallen off.
Once Roger Douglas was back in the country, Cabinet agreed to modify the flat tax proposal, but most of the package remained. The asset sales would proceed regardless of public opinion. The national airline would be sold to a consortium including its competitors, Japan and Qantas Airlines. Also on the block were the Maui platform and natural gas reserves and distribution network, the petrochemical fertilizer and methanol plants, the public share of the oil refinery and oil reserves and the Motunui natural gas to synthetic petrol plant, which meets 30% of our petrol needs. All would be sold to the New Zealand-based multinational Fletcher Challenge. Over half of New Zealand's banking and insurance sector was publicly owned. All these companies would be sold to their Australian and British competitors and Fay Richwhite and Fletcher Challenge. The New Zealand shipping line, established by the third Labour government, would be sold to its European competitor, Associated Container Transport. New Zealand Steel and the country's iron sand resources ended up in the hands of its giant Australian competitor, BHP. There were few constraints on other foreign investors.
We like to know what's happening, so we run an approval system, but we seldom turn people down. And these days especially, we're keen that people should come in from overseas and set up here. So anything that can be done from the government's point of view will be done to encourage that.
At first, the intention was to sell the Forestry Corporation as a going concern, but deciding how much the forests were worth was taking too long for Roger Douglas. He was also under pressure from the big timber companies, who didn't want to compete with the new corporation. So he decided the quick way to determine the value of the forests and satisfy the timber companies was to simply sell the forests off in blocks to the highest bidder.
To me, it seemed a remarkable thing to do. These forests, don't forget, were owned by the taxpayers of this country. It's their money that established them over the last 30, 40 years. And to turn round and sell, often at fire sale prices, the results of all that investment, all that expenditure, all that dedication from staff and workmen to companies from overseas, to the Japanese, to Malaysians, to whoever came in with a reasonable bid, to me just seemed appalling.
A public opinion survey showed that 79% unequivocally opposed selling state forests, only 4% unequivocally favoured selling them.
It certainly wasn't a popular action, as far as I can judge. Nobody I've spoken to has thought it's a good idea to have done this, particularly when you think, the way I bitterly, I suppose, sum it up is that it's taken politicians 3 years to get rid of what it took a pretty good government department 66 years to build up.
Teachers can be released.
In May 1988, PICO's Education Review Committee reported to the Minister of Education, David Longy.
Bad system, good people. Good people. As our consultant said, the system was in fact carried along on the backs of the dedication and the professional integrity of the people working in it.
Oh yes, we get frustrated by the old Department of Education. Oh yes, we get frustrated by education boards, but that's not what it's really about. But of course, as far as the Treasury were concerned, that's what it really was about, because until you could get through these structures, these administrative structures, you could not begin to bring market disciplines to education. And to that extent, their goals are clear in here. They were heading towards the dismemberment or dismantling of central bureaucracies. They were heading towards schools as competitive units. They were heading towards schools as acting under very, very tight financial discipline so that funding could be capped, and preferably perhaps towards privatisation.
It is not an abdication of assurance of controls and quality. It is a major democratisation at the level of the board, particularly for primary schools, and for secondary schools, an enhancement of their role.
A campaign of public consultation began.
The idea, of course, about the whole PICO thing is to make sure that you as teachers have access to ready decision-making. When you're on a board of trustees, you will...
Schools and the public were invited to make submissions about the PICO report.
Democracy and its authority, and the two have to work together.
The invitation was well received. Submissions poured in.
We were concerned about staffing levels, the ability of schools in richer communities to shift resources into staff funding, and therefore we could see at that point the whole gap between the rich and poor being blown apart, and or just being expanded through. So we tried to focus on those issues.
There were 12,000 submissions, which the government considered and duly ignored, because in 1988 along came the White Paper, August 1988, Tomorrow's Schools.
The reform which the government is announcing today will be amongst the most important the government will ever implement.
Clearly there are a number of agendas in the pot. There's the Treasury agenda, which is a matter of shifting responsibility, in essence, or the government's agenda, shifting responsibility as much as possible for outcomes from central government to communities, without actually providing the resources and other things that needed to go with that.
It was a victory for the new right in the halls of the Beehive. But I don't think the Minister of Education realised that.
Over time, limited government funding would force trustees to look for money elsewhere, to charge student fees, to seek corporate sponsorship, to advertise for paying pupils. They'd be forced to compete with one another, and so would kindergartens, polytechs and universities. In the 1940s, the first Labour government laid the cornerstone of the New Zealand welfare state when it established a free public health service. It was paid for out of taxes and available to all regardless of wealth. In the 1980s, Treasury decided the health service needed urgent restructuring. People should pay for their own health care through private insurance. Vouchers would be given to the poor so they could buy private insurance.
That wasn't so bad after all.
I do think that the people of New Zealand were generally satisfied with the health system. But as more and more reports came out saying that it wasn't functioning well, people began to believe that there's no smoke without fire.
Roger Douglas's friend, Alan Gibbs, had been appointed chairman of a 3-person task force to recommend changes to hospitals and related services. Assisted by Treasury official Peter Bushnell, the task force met in private, heard few submissions and reported in April 1988.
I want to emphasise that the central issue in our report is the creation of an internal market in the health system to set prices as a guide and control on management.
The Gibbs report was met with a lot of favour from a lot of people, especially a lot of the big business people.
As far as the hospital side of our business is concerned, I see a longer-term possibility of contracting to the public sector, and we're quite excited about this.
When I first read the Gibbs report, I can remember thinking, this is the beginning of the end, because it only presented two options. It presented option A, which was privatisation, the whole lot, and option B, which was contracting out, funder-provider split, those sorts of ideas.
The proposition of having a contractual relationship between the regional health authorities and the providers of health, in my view, puts the system at risk of being handed over slowly but inevitably to private health interests.
Professional and public opposition was widespread. Health Minister David Cagill distanced himself from the task force.
But I believe that it is irresponsible for him to claim, and to keep on claiming, for example, that we can eliminate waiting lists. To claim that hospital waiting lists are somehow a symptom of a system that is broken down or that can't cope. To claim that with better management and greater efficiency, waiting lists would disappear. I believe that I
guess it was like a bit of a political hot potato, because it had met with such a lot of general disease that it faded into the background. But it was still there, and it was still casting a shadow over future decisions that were being made in health.
I think in the end that someone will get the structure right, because I think all around the world, government, state sector systems that are run like ours, like the British National Health Service, all have a similar structural problem. Our report was apparently a Treasury officer just returned from the United Kingdom, and every person he spoke to over there had a copy of our report. They thought that would be likely the way they would have to go to fix the British system, which has similar problems. So I'm not really dismayed in the long run. I think that for the health of New Zealanders, we're going to have to go that way, and I think sooner or later it's going to happen.
The Business Roundtable lobbied hard to keep the revolution going. They used the level of public debt to justify selling public assets and cutting government services.
We've got to get to the other side of the river. We're in the middle of the river now, and we'll drown if we don't do something about it. We just can't go on borrowing. Whether we like it or not, we will find the shutters coming down, and we truly can become a third world country unless we pull ourselves together.
And that meant pulling apart the state. The state sector bill dismantled the public service. The public service unions campaigned against the bill.
Since learnt how to begin to organise a press conference.
The State-Owned Enterprise Act took away the trading elements of the state and put them into their own little enterprises so that they could then be commercialised, sold off, or whatever the government wanted to do with them. And the State Sector Act then broke up the rest of the state from a unified state sector into little groups that they could then be dealt with in any way that the government chose. So instead of having to deal with the whole state sector and make changes that way, they could then look at one particular sector of the state sector and make changes to it.
Each department would be run like a private corporation, controlled by a new chief executive.
That person, in turn, becomes the employing authority for that particular department, and can then flow those kinds of appointments on down through the service. That ought to be of concern not only to public servants, but to every citizen in New Zealand. It's a most dangerous bill from a constitutional point of view.
Thousands of public service workers protested in rolling stoppages throughout the country, but the Labour government passed the bill on time and with little change.
Minister, are you proud of this bill?
Yes, I am. It's going to serve the community as a whole and the public service employees very well in the years ahead.
Government departments could be reviewed and restructured and then reviewed and restructured again. Each change would produce redundancies and a move towards private providers and user pays.
It's leading edge, what I would call leading edge kind of work in terms of the privatization, in terms of an honest assessment of what the risks are to government, and in terms of how risks are accounted for. There are just things going on here in New Zealand structurally that simply will not be occurring in most of the world for many, many years.
We are no one-man band.
Order.
And I make no apology for the vigorous debate that has preceded many of this government's reforms. But let no one doubt our unity of purpose, the unity and strength of our commitment to restore the ideals of stability and opportunity which made this country great.
In the second half of 1988, with tension increasing between David Lange and Roger Douglas, public support for the government was plummeting, but the finance ministers pressed on with their programme.
Douglas out! Douglas out! Douglas out! Douglas out! Douglas!
Roger Douglas sincerely believed that the interests of the lower socioeconomic groupings, the unemployed, the people on basic wages, would be better served by continuing the reforms than they would be by backing off them and trying to improve the level of social service delivery. Now, he sincerely believed that, whereas Lange sincerely believed the direct antithesis.
Associate Finance Minister Richard Prebble was determined to sell Air New Zealand. The Labour Party hierarchy did not agree.
If there is a proposal to lose the majority government shareholding, we'll be putting our case quite strongly that that isn't the commitment that we went to the electorate on, and there would have to be very good reasons for us to then change that commitment.
I would expect that we will make a decision definitely on this side of Christmas.
A decision on who will get 35%?
We'll make a decision on the future of the whole airline.
There was no sign that, that there was anything improper here. It was just politically very unacceptable to the Labour Party, who in this case backed Lange and said, you know, to Lange, we want this process slowed down and we want to be consulted. So the pressure built up and built up and built up, and Prebble in fact did have the majority support of Cabinet. The Prime Minister couldn't slow this process down by using his position as Chairman of Cabinet because the Cabinet itself was going with Prebble.
And Richard Prebble was going ahead with asset sales. The Shipping Corporation was next. He again resisted consultation with the Labour Party. On the 4th of November 1988, David Lange sacked Richard Prebble from his post as Minister of State-Owned Enterprises.
My view of these matters is that this is a government and that you cannot have what would be unassailably proper procedures in the private sector being used in a government situation.
Mr. Douglas, is it true that you've asked Mr. Lange to consult more with Cabinet?
With the sacking of Richard Prebble, the conflict between Roger Douglas and David Lange came to a head.
At 1 o'clock today I received a letter from the Honourable Roger Douglas. That letter began thus. After long and very careful consideration, I have decided to tell Caucus that I can no longer work as Finance Minister in a cabinet led by you. I received that letter. I took it to be a letter of resignation.
You're already in the money. Look, mate, do it. It's a good deal.
These guys have had an initial panic reaction, which is to disinvest. How much further they disinvest is anyone's guess. I think the next 24 hours are going to be crucial. It'll be very interesting to see the way the European market interprets this news, and then the way that the American market interprets it after that.
It was impossible for me to continue. I stayed in as long as I thought that I could help confidence in the marketplace. But when events unfold, which you cannot control, then it was simply time for me to go. Interest rates since Richard Prebble's sacking have gone up by well over 1%. That is entirely unnecessary. That is costing people a lot of money, or will, in terms of their mortgages, and it's costing people investment, and it's costing jobs, and that was not something which I could sit by and watch as Minister of Finance.
David Cagill now became Minister of Finance.
I don't see taking over this particular office at this stage as a break in policy, a change in direction in any way. And it seems to me that that is the most important statement that can be made in terms of the markets.
I had several meetings with David Longy trying to convince him that there were alternatives, and presenting him some of them, and feeling almost as though at the end he was a captive. In fact, I recall once saying to him, surely you could get support from Helen Clark for this position. He said, the only supporter I have in the cabinet is Russell Marshall. Helen Clark is so dry she's combustible. And at that point it was clear that Longy had no control whatever in cabinet, and that the new right was now totally in control of the government.
You know, and the pressure of being one person standing against this, even though Prebble and Douglas were out of cabinet, became too much. That was his one flaw as a politician, that he couldn't put together a coalition to back what he was doing. His coalition, in fact, that had got him into office had been Roger Douglas, Richard Prebble and their friends. I mean, those were his mates.
When the Labour Party caucus re-elected Roger Douglas to cabinet, it was too much for David Longy. 7 days later, he resigned.
And I just want to salute you for a great contribution to New Zealand, for a great contribution, in fact, to the world political stage, because you are recognised and known as a leader internationally who has done some exciting things for this country. And I think that's just something that we should all say thank you for. And my friend, I'm sorry to see you go.
Can I tell you, Geoffrey? I've changed my mind.
New Prime Minister Geoffrey Palmer kept Roger Douglas out of economic policy, but with little chance of re-election, the government continued to implement the new right agenda. Richard Prebble was reappointed and told to sell more state assets.
We're here today to announce the sale of Telecom Corporation of New Zealand and to introduce the partners who will be guiding the company in the future.
The sale to an American-led consortium was opposed by 96% of New Zealanders. Promises safeguarding the community's interests were engraved in stone tablets made of plastic.
I'd like to thank the Treasury and the advisors to Treasury, Butler Wilson and CS First Boston.
Today, ladies and gentlemen, I want to share with you National's economic vision. This really is a very proud day for the National Party, and we're just so thrilled that so many of you have made it your business to travel to be here today.
A general election was due in November 1990. The National Party knew it could win.
Checkbooks are always open for political parties, so long as they get the things right.
The goals by themselves are very specific. 3% growth, we haven't attained it, is very specific. Halving unemployment is very specific. Balancing the budget is very specific.
They were looking for somebody who had an agenda, a plan, an ideology. And of a pretty talentless caucus between 1987 and 1990, there was really only one person on the economic front who had that agenda, and that was Ruth Richardson. And she basically made her ideology the party's, principally because she faced no opposition.
Ruth Richardson had the help of two economists, Martin Hames from the National Bank and Ian Rennie from Treasury.
There's no question that the paid advisors that were put into the opposition, one by Treasury and the other by the commercial community, had a significant influence in, if you like, fleshing out the ideology of Ruth Richardson and turning it into practical policies that could be implemented if National gained power.
National began the 1990 election campaign with the slogan, "Creating a Decent Society," and presented itself as defending the New Zealand way of life.
What about your overtime rates, your penal rates?
Good question. We are not changing overtime rates or penal rates. That's a Labour lie. And they had to take their their advertisement off radio yesterday because it's a lie.
The plans being made by Ruth Richardson and Treasury hardly featured in National's campaign promises.
Yeah, that's my bit. Yeah, that's my bit.
Treasury officials again prepared a brief for their next Minister of Finance. They recommended shifting health, education and welfare costs onto families and individuals, reducing corporate taxes, cutting benefits and wages, and encouraging foreign investment in this country.
Then you'll be able.
Meanwhile, Jim Bolger was promising tougher controls on foreign ownership, abolition of the superannuation surtax, and no cuts in health and education spending.
Can you give a cast iron guarantee that they will not be broken, that they will all be implemented?
No, we will honour our promises. The policies we thought through very carefully before we put them into our manifesto. They're there to be honoured and to be put in place.
The 1990 general election offered New Zealanders a choice between National and Labour, now led by Mike Moore. There was no great enthusiasm. Voter turnout was the lowest ever. As expected, National won a huge majority.
But here is Jim Bolger. Look at the media huddle around him. I'm staying well out of that. He's going over to the phone to pick it up. Mike Moore's been waiting for a while.
Thank you, Mike, and as you say, the result has been, it's substantial.
Right beside him, as soon as Mike Moore conceded, a couple of Treasury officials had been driven, apparently, on that particular day to Tikawiti to brief the Prime Minister on this crisis that had accompanied or had been brewing in the background, away from public gaze. And they came to Jim Bolger on election night and said, Prime Minister, we've got something we really must urgently tell you. And according to the Prime Ministerial aides, Jim Bolger and the aides said, you've got to be joking, sport, now's the time for partying. Come and see us tomorrow. And sure enough, there they were, in their suits, a couple of them, in their dossiers, and very early on Sunday morning they briefed the Prime Minister at his home in Tikawiti as to this crisis. That basically the Bank of New Zealand was on the verge of collapse, that there had been a considerable blowout in government spending, absolutely unaccounted for in terms of the budgets. And I can remember the Prime Minister must have obviously been quite shaken by this, this news. Drastic and urgent measures needed to be taken.
That afternoon, Jim Bolger flew back to Wellington. Treasury claimed the crisis was so deep and urgent that only one course of action was possible. Government expenditure had to be slashed across the board.
Now we've got to go away, and they tell us there's a little bit of work to do. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That allowed rapid advancement of the new right agenda. Jim Bolger accepted Treasury's recommendations and appointed Ruth Richardson Minister of Finance.
And Roger, will you make sure they all go out, because some of them we mightn't pick that they're not the new members.
He looked at our manifesto, which was sitting in the front desk of the caucus room, and he pointed at it and he said, and we've got some problems with this as well. And I can remember turning to one of my colleagues to my right and saying, dear God, we're going to rat, and we've only been in for 5 days.
Well, to be fair to the caucus members, the new caucus members in particular, they weren't informed enough. They didn't know enough about what was going on. An enormous amount of trust is required in those circumstances. They played a wait-and-see role, but of course things move so dramatically fast that you're waiting to see developments which don't relate initially to, at the end, to those things that drove them at the beginning. I think it's not critical to say that they were inexperienced, but many were. Those who were experienced were in large measure ignored.
$640 million was lent to the Bank of New Zealand to save it from collapse, and the new government began cutting expenditure.
It's a bit murky.
A bit murky, like this announcement. On budget night, the table to surplus, that is the government's cash position, was projected to be $4.989 billion in the financial year ended 30 June 1991. Today I am announcing a revised projection of $2.556 billion as a surplus.
Treasury and I guess the Reserve Bank scared the incoming Prime Minister and Cabinet into taking precipitate action. And it was action that Ruth Richardson was quite happy to take. After all, it ideologically suited her and it suited ministers like Upton and Luxton and Williamson again. But there was no question that Bolger and Birch, who were meant to be holding the strings on Richardson, in the same way I guess that somebody walks a dangerous dog on a leash, there was no question that they felt the situation was so urgent that the dog should be unleashed. So it was.
Over the next few weeks, Ruth Richardson and her Treasury advisers told the new ministers about the large cuts they wanted from most government departments.
They wrote, as had become the case, all of the economic advice to all of those other ministers. There is no, after Labor, there was no contestability of advice. Treasury gave the sole advice, and any alternate opinion had to come from outside.
So that would include, say, education,
that's right,
health, whatever,
all
social.
The whole lot.
A lot of people make the claim that Treasury is too powerful. And I think that what they fail to realise is that this is a very contestable business. Everybody has the ear of ministers, from interest groups that are able to pour a lot of money into getting advice from all sources, through to the constituent who writes a letter to the minister. And in that sort of environment, it's the power of the ideas and the analysis that counts. So if governments listen to you, it's because you've got good ideas and you can back it with solid analysis.
Mr. Speaker, the government has prepared tomorrow's announcements in view of the disastrous state of the New Zealand economy which we have inherited. Without exception, all the key indicators on economic health are looking bad.
6 weeks after the election, the government announced its first economic package. Sickness benefits for solo parents were cut by 11%. Widows' benefits were cut by 17%. The dole for adults under 25 was cut by 25%. Charges for doctors' visits and medicines were increased. The public health system would be reviewed, education spending was cut, and further reports commissioned. The welfare state was being redesigned.
Basically, if you move with enough speed, as they had for that December 19 package, you can get away with it. But what's very clear, though, is that the December 19 package was written long way before the 1990 election. It wasn't prepared after the election. It was probably in full preparation in August, September, before the election.
People are already struggling to survive just with the basic necessities of food, going to the doctors, things like that. So those things, which are the necessities which people can't meet now, are going to be put even further out of their reach.
Beneficiaries are going to have $1 billion less to spend next year. That's $1 billion less spending in the shops. That's $1 billion less production. That's $1 billion less employment.
Lower benefits were necessary for the next step in the New Right programme, reducing labour costs by cutting the pay packets of unskilled, low-paid and young workers.
One of the major reasons why this government has had to face up to doing the things that we announced is that we need to create the gap between work and welfare.
Yeah, signed and sealed. One copy for you, one for me.
The second measure to cut labour costs was announced by the new Minister of Labour, Bill Birch. The Employment Contracts Bill completely rewrote New Zealand's industrial relations law.
It is policy which is developed to suit
the situation in New Zealand, and it is the result of several years' work.
It's not in the country's interests to leave that 100-year-old, highly regulated, rigid, legislated for environment in place.
That removed national bargaining structures that were in place at the time. Most workers in the workforce were covered by a document that was negotiated nationally between unions and employers and set down the basic minimums that they were entitled to at work, and that included things, basic things that you would call human rights, I guess, like lunch breaks, tea breaks, health and safety procedures, personal grievance procedures, wage rates, all those sorts of things that workers had generally come to accept as entitlements when they took a job, and it put workers on their own and gave the employer ultimate power to set those wages and conditions.
The extent of the proposed reforms amazed the nation. The words trade union weren't even used in the new law. Employers welcomed the proposals. The bill would enable them to cut wages, abolish overtime and penal rates, and save money by cutting back the working conditions of their employees.
Too many New Zealanders still float in a dreamtime world that has the good life as a matter of right.
Cheap labour would make New Zealand more attractive to international investors. There were rolling strikes, stoppages, rallies and marches throughout the country. Submissions were made to the Select Committee and to government.
There was a huge debate amongst the unions about whether we'd have a general strike, and in the end that was voted against at a CTU conference. My feeling at the time was that we should have organised some sort of public disruption. That sort of thing could have been done and wasn't done, and it wasn't done because we had been weakened under the Labour government and we lacked that really strong leadership and direction.
He wants us to get into government!
The legislation was passed on schedule. It was even tougher on workers and unions than originally proposed.
What's good for business is good for New Zealanders. Finally, they've got to have the confidence to invest and to employ. Their bottom lines are being pretty bashed around at the moment, and yet at the end of the day, it's they who will be the ones that prosper from the lower interest rates, from the better employment laws, from a government that's living within their means. We're doing this, finally, for business confidence and for jobs.
This is where we're going. This is step one, this is step two, this is step three. You don't need to think. Got it all mapped out and we'll get to here. And so she had the whole path mixed and marked, and everybody said, great, fine, let's go.
The new government's first New Year's honours awarded Douglas Myers, chairman of the Business Round Table, a CBE. Roger Douglas was made a Knight Bachelor.
All right. I don't believe that there are any perceptible differences. The approach was the same. The key elements were the same. Hijack, ambush, speed. Before they've got a chance to think, move on to something else, whilst ensuring that the announced package sees completion.
Education is a key investment in our economic future. The government is determined to provide an environment that enables businesses and individuals to develop internationally competitive and innovative skills.
Fees for tertiary education were increased. Most students had to take out loans.
With education, there's no hitch. Now it's only for the rich. Now it's only for the rich.
Every New Zealander has a responsibility to stand up for what's right, and what's right is a decent education for a decent society.
I think the more limited objectives have been to bring about user pays in education, while their longer term agenda has been to move more towards privatisation in education, which might not be total, but certainly With what they've done with bulk funding of universities, they're wanting to bring that about in schools. And, you know, the user pays side of it is, I think, moving more towards an Americanised sort of education system.
The students continued their protests, but with no effect. Government funding to polytechs and universities was squeezed.
So far, I don't think the opposition has been very successful, and I think if it continues as it has been over the last 4 or 5 years, it won't actually be very successful. I think until we actually start getting unions, student associations working together and mobilising their membership and giving genuine leadership in a struggle opposed to the government policies, then we won't actually be successful. But that isn't to say we can't be successful if those things happen.
When the financial crisis was first revealed, Minister of Health Simon Upton appointed a task force to come up with a plan to overhaul public health services.
The task force was led by a banker, and included in the group was a lady from Treasury who's very interested in health economics. And in particular, she believes very strongly in the market model of delivery. They moved very quickly in the direction of major changes in the healthcare system. But none of us were told of this. It was all done in secret, it was done behind closed doors, and it was done with a very narrow ideological group of advisors.
The government has concluded that major changes are needed to create a new health system that is effective and flexible in the delivery of healthcare services to the community.
The elected boards which had run public hospitals were replaced by government-appointed business people. Patients would be charged for their health services. A community card entitled poor people to a government subsidy when they went to the doctor or to hospital.
It's not a question of whether or not this is what New Zealanders want. It's not a question of whether or not this is the way New Zealanders see themselves, because the initial public relations advice that they had said very clearly that a great many New Zealanders believed in the healthcare system that they had.
Overseeing the change to the new regime was Ron Trotter, ex-chairman of the Business Round Table, head of Fletcher Challenge. A well-known television journalist was recruited to front an advertising campaign.
This unused operating theatre has been here for 8 years, but it's not just unused today. The fact is, it's never been used. It's just one example of why our current health system had to change. The aim is to reduce administration costs, wastage and duplication of services. This is the tiny South Island town of Lawrence.
The public seemed unconvinced, but the changes continued anyway.
Think about your health service and what it means to you and what it will mean in the future. You're only going to end up paying more and more, and the system won't be cost effective. It's been proven not to work in other countries.
Some charges were reduced, but the user pays framework remained.
So the process is intact. Everything is quite capable of moving towards a private healthcare system, similar to what is the primary source of the management of the healthcare system in the United States.
As government expenditure was tightened, private health insurance boomed. Public hospitals sold advertising space on their buildings, and American multinational hospital corporations came looking for investment opportunities. The national government completed most asset sales begun by Labour, but retained the Housing Corporation, Electricorp and the railway system. But soon that, including the rail ferries, was sold to an American company and Fay Richwhite.
I think everybody stands to gain. It's one of those transactions that I really think is a win-win-win. It was win for the New Zealand public when the Crown sold New Zealand Rail. I'd like to think, like every other good transaction, it's a win for the new owners, but in the long run, the New Zealand public will benefit from an improved railway network and operation.
With most national assets sold, attention turned to the investments built up by regional and local body ratepayers.
The people of Auckland, and I think of New Zealand as a whole, have felt deeply betrayed by the process of privatisation. And it's an emotional thing as much as a rational thing, and there's nothing wrong with it being an emotional thing. People think that over generations we've built up assets in this region and nationally too, which are ours, our taxes, our work, our effort.
In Auckland, the plan was to privatise the port. The government passed legislation putting the sale in the hands of the Auckland Regional Council.
Any decision to sell any part of the Port of Auckland is in the hands of the people of Auckland. It is not being forced by the government.
Soon, Aucklanders voiced their opposition.
Sovereignty, what does that mean in our country?
You tell me.
I think it means hanging on to assets that if they're that attractive to foreign investors, why don't we make the most of them?
33,000 written protests came into the Auckland Regional Council.
What right have they got to sell accumulated public assets to get themselves off the hook?
It doesn't belong to the Regional Council or this government. It's the property of the people of Auckland who built that port and worked hard to see it the success that it is today.
The Regional Council voted against privatisation. The country's largest port remained in public ownership. In local elections, the newly formed Alliance Party won a majority on the Regional Assets Trust.
The government itself has kept out of it. And I think they just didn't want to fight. They'd set this thing up, it hadn't worked out the way they wanted. It was meant to sell these assets and then it got a majority elected who wouldn't do it.
Auckland's port, bus company, rubbish trucks, water and sewage system remained in public ownership. But other communities lost their assets. In Wellington, council management put up proposals to contract out and privatise many council services.
The public, you know, overall, if you poll them, they oppose privatisation, and they diligently come to the annual plan meetings, they write submissions, they fill out petitions, they lobby their councillors. But what happens is that when the councillors sit around the table, they say, we've been elected to give leadership. Now, what we'll take into account what you have to say, but it's not going to be decisive. I finally, the councillor, will make the decision. So by this kind of, I would say, a distorted view of representation, the councillors believe that they can vote with impunity the way that they want. So in other words, the councillors don't represent their constituents. They become a special elite once they're around the table.
The buses were sold to a Scottish-based multinational, Stagecoach. The power network was partially sold into Canadian control, and the sewage treatment system contracted out to an English company.
And we as a new government have these two task forces, one looking at foreign investment in New Zealand. Are there hurdles, are there bureaucratic blockages that we ought not to have? And the other task force is looking at how we can make New Zealand more attractive to international investors by our promotion efforts.
Aotearoa, New Zealand. Behind the veil of South Pacific beauty is an expanding economy, well prepared for the 21st century. Now highly competitive after a decade of reforms, New Zealand invites international partners to share in an exciting business future. Supportive government policies provide a commercially transparent environment with no hidden costs. There are low interest rates and inflation restrained by law. A freely convertible currency with no restrictions on transfers. Equitable taxation without levies on capital gains. New Zealand, the profitable partner.
By 1993, most banks and insurance companies were owned and controlled overseas. The whole telecommunications sector was in the hands of foreign multinationals. Foreign ownership of manufacturing had increased. The forestry sector was almost entirely controlled by multinationals. Foreign holdings on the New Zealand Stock Exchange had increased from 14% in 1984 to almost 50% by 1992, and the half-dozen companies which could have been described as New Zealand multinationals, like Brierley's, Lion Nathan and Fletcher Challenge, were now classed as foreign-owned.
Not only, Richard mentioned that you've been strengthened by us joining you, but I think we've been strengthened by having you joining us. And I'm really looking forward to the relationship, and welcome to the Irwin family.
For ordinary New Zealanders, the possibilities for opposing new right policies seemed exhausted. Demonstrations, petitions, opinion polls were ignored, trade unions had been defeated. Rank-and-file members of the Labour and National parties felt they had little influence on their parliamentary leaders. Democratic structures like hospital, harbour and power boards had been abolished. City councils were under pressure to sell off assets and privatise services. Democracy in New Zealand had been limited and redefined.
Some individuals in the corporate business sector have been considerably empowered by the events of the last 10 years. But I would guess that 90% of the population of New Zealand has been thoroughly disempowered compared to the influence and effect that they could have on their economy as it impacted on their daily lives in previous decades. We ran what was essentially an insulated economy. We did that for very good reasons. It was one of the instruments we used to achieve control over our lives and to achieve the sorts of social ambitions that most New Zealanders wanted. Some of the options we used may or may not be any longer available for one reason or another, but many of them are. We've simply abandoned them for ideological reasons. One of the consequences of that, of course, has been the thorough interpenetration of the New Zealand economy by large transnational corporations. Many New Zealanders will find, as a result of that, of course, that it will become increasingly difficult to achieve their social ambitions because they will have no means of controlling those organisations, and those organisations, of course, have no interest in the social infrastructure of New Zealand. Probably many of their boards of directors are not even entirely sure where New Zealand is. So why should they give diddly squat about it otherwise than as a set of sub-accounts to a large transnational corporation?
The new right owed a large part of its success to an electoral system which always gave either National or Labour a clear majority. Frequently called an elected dictatorship, first past the post had given key ministers the control they needed to introduce their reforms.
No symbolism in the fact that it's Guy Fawkes Day that we meet. Listen up, you budgets! Enough is enough! We've had it up to here with your two-party stuff. You're sitting pretty while we go down the drain. Let's have MPs so our votes are not in vain. Thank you.
In 1992 and 1993, there were two referendums on the electoral system. In the first, voters chose between first past the post and a range of proportional representation systems. In the second referendum, the choice was between first past the post and the preferred alternative.
They thought, no, let's go vote for this, don't be ridiculous. You know, we'll throw them a bone of a referendum. And the 1992 referendum, to decide which was going to be the policy option, came as a huge shock. Huge. Shook this place. This place was traumatised for about a week, actually. Coming back here and seeing, my God, they hate us. You know, they hate the system. They're voting for reform.
Only 15% supported the existing first-past-the-post system. The second referendum would be held at the same time as the next general election, November 1993.
Look out for your Referendum 93 pamphlet.
You'll find it with your community newspaper.
It tells you what you need to know about the two options.
First past the post?
Or MMP. It could be the most important political decision we ever make.
A number of members of Parliament, Helen Clark, Labour leader, Tony Ryle of the Electoral Law Select Committee, Doug Graham and those got together and said, hey, you know, how can we stop this? And then suddenly realised that it looked really bad for these traditional enemies to conspire to try and frustrate public will.
Up until April '93, you know, really the ERC, Electoral Reform Coalition, had really had it had it to ourselves, and we were on a roll, you know, to win. And then suddenly in April '93, Peter Sutcliffe launches his newspaper advertisements.
At the end of the day, the first past the post system has in recent years finally delivered. It's bailed us out of the hole we dug for ourselves 20 or 30 years ago, and we are now one of the best performing economies in the Western world.
You say the economy would go down the gurgler if we got MMP?
It would put enormous stresses and strains and put the achievements of the last 4 or 5 years at risk without a question.
Steve Murray, is that true?
Peter Sutcliffe set up a campaign office through which the business community could fund major advertising to oppose MMP.
We believe voting for MMP is gambling with our country's future. Our children could pay the price. Is it a risk we can afford? Tick the top box. Reject MMP.
The Electoral Reform Coalition, on the other hand, had a vast body of people and built up networks of activists through allied organisations and sort of spread that network out so that you know, we found people in every little, in places like Takaka and Kaikoura and Lumsden, and you know, we thought who knows who, and educated them about what MMP was about.
What we're wanting is a system where every vote counts equally, and that pressure groups can't go and tap on the shoulder of their favourite cabinet minister and get what they want, and that's what they stand to lose with MMP.
But what's fairer and simpler than one person, one vote?
What is fairer and simpler is one person with a vote that counts no matter where they live, and parties getting seats in Parliament in proportion to their level of support throughout the community. That's the difference.
In the last week before the referendum, Peter Sutcliffe's campaign spent more on advertising than the Labour and National parties together.
21 extra MPs will cost us millions of dollars every year. Enough is enough. Tick the top box. Reject MMP.
Saturation advertising seemed to be shifting undecided voters against MMP.
Since May, support for the present system has climbed to 41% last weekend. Support for MMP has remained static throughout October on 46%. The undecided are down to 12%.
It was sort of frantic as we sort of juggled with what could we afford and what else could we do.
Election day produced a good turnout. This was expected to favour MMP.
Just put a tick in either of these circles and one tick on that page.
In the general election, the choice was between National and Labour, with maybe 2 or 3 seats going to third parties.
Support for MMP nationwide, we've been tracking this all night. There you see it, 53.8% on a vote count of 91%. So 91%, and you see that Rod Donald there, who we've talked to 2 or 3 times tonight, is cutting the MMP cake. He can well afford to do so with 91% of the vote counted at this stage. We have gone for MMP, and we have gone for MMP comprehensively. We have a new system of voting.
I think the tremendous result tonight, of course, is MMP, because the history of this country... They flung everything at it, and the people said no.
And the National Government and the Labor Party will have to get their head around the fact that they no longer own Parliament, the people own it. And that's going to make a big difference.
National lost its huge majority, and the minor parties held 4 seats, and the balance of power.
what New Zealand very, very much needs now is stability, so that those who are interested in New Zealand, whether they be existing investors or potential investors, do not take fright. That's in everybody's interest, no matter who they voted for across New Zealand today.
Next morning, Treasury officials arrived at work early and began shredding documents. They needn't have bothered. Within a few days, the national government had re-established a working majority. For the time being, the interests of international investors and multinational corporations would continue to reshape New Zealand society.